Welcome to this Fane online event. I'm delighted to introduce Peace Adzo Medie, the author of His Only Wife and Nightbloom. It's an honor for me to talk to you today. We're going to be talking mainly about your latest book, Nightbloom, and so thank you for your time today. First of all, just as a little bit of an overview question, it would just be amazing for people who maybe haven't heard of your work or haven't read your books, if you could just introduce maybe yourself a little bit, but mainly Nightbloom, and just give us a little teaser of what it's about.
Yes, thank you. I'm really happy to be chatting with you today. So I am a writer. I write both fiction and nonfiction. I am also an associate professor in politics at the University of Bristol, but also a novelist. And Nightbloom is my second novel. It's set mostly in Ghana, but also partly in the US, and it tells the story of Akorfa and Selasi, who are two cousins, and but also the very best of friends when they start out in life. And over time, a rift develops, and it's not always clear why there's this rift. And the book is basically about, why is it that your friendship changed so much, and the secrets that came between them and contributed to this rift. So we get to follow Akorfa and Selasi into their 30s. Akorfa moves to the US to become a doctor. Selasi remains in Ghana. And through all of this, these two cousins are trying to work out what it is that damaged their relationship. And so the book is about this friendship, but also about the possibility of reconciliation.
Yeah, lovely. That's such a good overview. So following on from that, I think the first thing I really wanted to talk to you about was the structure you chose for the novel, because I think that was really fundamental to kind of its impact. So as a reader, you begin and you almost assume, well, I assumed for sure that we were going to just follow Akorfa's point of view throughout the entire book. And then this perspective changes around halfway through, and you see Selasi's point of view. So this was incredibly effective, because it kind of dismantles what you think you knew, and you start to kind of question the truths. So I wanted to ask you just how you came about the decision to do that with the structure, and also what you were really hoping to do and what you were hoping the effect would be on the narrative, just to offer these two sides.
Yes, no, I mean, my structure is, the structure is one of my favorite parts about the book and about writing the book, the writing process. So yes, we get to hear Akorfa's side of the story, and Selasi tells the same story. And I did this because a key part of the book is an exploration, or the exploration of truth and of memory. And I really wanted to look at how it is that two people can see the same thing and experience the same thing and come out of it with a very different understanding. And I think we've all seen this in real life, where two people have the exact same experience and they come back with very different stories. And so key to the book is this exploration of truth.
Yeah.
And how do we construct truth, but also memory, because the book is, that they're adults and they're telling the story about their childhood. And you find that they both remember things very differently. And to me, it's not about someone making up a story so much as how we construct reality to make it easier for us. So it's like, how do you, we ask people the question, how do you sleep at night? Right? So it's basically these two people trying to remember things in the way that makes it easier for them to sleep at night. And so that is why I went with this structure. And it was a very, when I first wrote the book, it was only Selasi's voice and Selasi's perspective.
Oh, wow.
but then I really, as you know, the more I wrote and the more I discussed the book with people, I realized that, you know, I really wanted to hear Akorfa's part of the story, because the way it was written before, Selasi just tells us about Akorfa. We never really get to hear from Akorfa herself.
Mhm.
And I thought it would be interesting to let her tell her own story.
Mm.
And so the book itself, I wrote in a little over a year. And then I spent about 3 years just playing with the structure. And, you know, so before it was just Selasi. And then I thought maybe it'll be alternating chapters. But that really didn't work, because with alternating chapters, you very quickly realize that, okay, the stories are not identical. And then I feel like that takes the reader out of the character's perspective, and the reader begins to question. And I mean, I wanted the reader to question what they were reading, but at the end of the book, not while, you know, they were in the midst of the story. So I played around with structure for a few years before settling on this structure.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I think that's what makes it so powerful, is that the reader is totally lulled into thinking that this is the narrative they have, and then you just suddenly have the shift. Whereas if you know that you're going to constantly be going back and forth, you might not have that kind of impact. I was just wondering, is there a reason why you put Akorfa's narrative first?
Yes. Like I said before, Selasi, it was only Selasi before, so it was Selasi's story, or her perspective, her narrative first. What I quickly realized though was that if Selasi's narrative was first, it would really puncture the effect that I was trying to create. Because if you read Selasi's story first, you would, before you get to Akorfa, you would not believe what she's saying. You'd probably have very strong negative feelings for her.
Yeah.
And I really wanted the reader to give her a chance, because at the end of the day, I think she does things that many of us will not agree with. But I also like to challenge readers to empathize with even very flawed characters, with characters that you don't agree with. I think it's easier to, you know, side with someone who's good and virtuous, but it's harder to side with someone who you maybe fundamentally disagree with. And so as a writer, I very much enjoy writing those kinds of characters that, you know, in some ways it's a challenge to get the reader to side with such characters. Yes.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I just wanted to pick out one bit that I found particularly poignant when I was reading it, and I wanted to ask how you felt kind of writing it. But there's a section where the reader finds out how Selasi was really treated by Akorfa's mother, which is something that we just didn't really know before. And then you suddenly get a completely different view of it. Akorfa's mother thinks she's been incredibly helpful and incredibly generous. And then we see the reality through Selasi's real experience. But I was just wondering how you approach portraying these two points of view. And if you, as a writer, do you feel like you know where the truth lies in that experience? Or were you just playing with this idea that none of us ever really know the truth of that experience? It's always going to be subjective. Or do you feel like deep down you know what happened then?
Yes, I do think I know exactly what happened, but then I also very much understand why both of them come away from it with a different understanding. I think that's just a very human reaction to life. And when I wrote, I devoted a lot of time to writing about just regular everyday interactions, right? Because it is these interactions that form, people's lives and that form memory, right? So it's things like, what did you say to me when I woke up in the morning? And did you smile with me when you passed me on the staircase? And these can be seen as really minor things. And one can question why focus on these very minor things? But these are the things that are the building blocks of life. That as people, I don't know if you have a colleague and you come into work and they give you a weird look.
Yeah.
Most people.
What have I done?
Exactly. You remember it. And maybe in the grand scheme of things, when the history of the world is written, nobody cares about that look. But to you, it is extremely important. And so I really wanted to focus on these little things. But yes, so writing about Selasi's experience with Akorfa's mother, and how she thought she was helping Selasi, and Selasi experienced it very differently and felt that she wasn't being helped, and in fact she was being hurt. And I just wanted the reader to see how it is that these two people can feel this way about this one thing that happened. And so when writing about both of them experiencing the same thing, I was very worried about repetition. And I thought, I don't want the reader to feel like they are being told, even though they are being told the same story twice, but I don't want them to feel like bogged down or bored when reading the book. And so what I did, like with those scenes with Akorfa's mother, what I did was to write it in such a way that when you read Akorfa's section, it's like you get to see half of it.
Yes.
You read Selasi's section and you get to see the other half. And it's then up to you to bring them together and reconcile these two halves that you've been presented with as a reader.
Yeah, definitely. Well, don't worry, it does not read repetitively at all. It was such a good read. Yeah, kind of following on for that, I wanted to ask you about characterization. So as with your first book, you have excellent characterization. You mentioned that you'd like dealing with kind of more complex characters and characters that maybe you don't necessarily agree with, but you have to understand as a reader. And I thought one of the best bits about it, as you were saying, with those very particular female friendships, especially when you're young, where, as you said, every little thing feels momentous and they're very intricate and they can be quite messy and they can be quite mean. And that was done really, really well. So I just wanted to ask you how you approached that, what your inspiration was. Did you read many books about female friendship and that kind of thing? And also, how did you build the particular writing styles for each character? Because they are very different. So as a reader, you do get the sense of their character quite easily.
Yeah, I did. I did read books about female friendship. But one of the ones that stayed with me was My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. And I just really loved, how, the world of these two girls somehow becomes so important that it fills out volumes.
Yeah.
And as you're reading, you're like, yes, this is deserving of attention and should be on the page and should be read. And so, characterization was something that I really wanted to do and just to do really well. And both girls are entirely fictional. But I did spend a great deal of time just thinking about what childhood looks like and what it feels like, and trying to remember and not being able to remember a lot of my own childhood, but trying to create a version that will feel really real to the readers. And as a writer, when I write, I tend to have very vivid images in my mind about place, about the people, their physical appearance, about their likes and dislikes and their mannerisms. And so I think this comes through in how I write characters, because by the time I'm 1-2 chapters into the book, they are so real.
Yeah.
And I think this is this very much informs how I wrote both of these characters. And then you ask a second question, which
sorry, that was a very long question. I was just asking about the style of their voice, because they sound very distinct when you're reading the characters. There's very subtle, you might not notice it, but I think there are quite subtle differences how they speak. So I just wanted to know more about that and how you came up with their voices.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you for noticing that in the first place. Thank you for reading my book so closely, because I wanted something. That was something that I wanted to do, but to be very subtle about it. And the fact is, these are two girls who grew up in the same place. Selasi does leave, Akorfa does leave, but they're still very similar. And so I didn't want to, have any kind of exaggerated dialect or anything to set them apart. But I just wanted to be really subtle. And in doing that, I had to go back to both of the characters and the essence of the characters.
Yeah.
And so Akorfa, one of the things that sets Akorfa apart is, or that differentiates her from Selasi, is she presents herself as incredibly intelligent, and she's very well read, and she eventually goes to the US. And by the time she's writing the book, she has spent over a decade in the US. So when you read her section, there are little things like she doesn't use a lot of Ghanaian phrases and expressions. She uses very standard English. She uses a lot of American words and descriptions, whereas Akorfa is also very sparse. Her sentences are kind of sparse almost.
Whereas, they're not very flowery and kind of
exactly
to the point.
Exactly. But that is how she is as a person, where she's like, I am smart and I'm going to tell you what happened and I'm not going to mess around. And Selasi is like, oh, I woke up this morning and this is how I felt. And the birds were chirping. And so when I was coming up with the voices for both of them, I really was paying attention to how were these two girls as people. Their innermost selves, and I wanted to bring that onto the page. And so anyway, I'm just really happy that you were able to spot the difference.
Oh no worries. Thank you so much. It worked. I totally, it was great. Moving on to more I guess like general themes. So one of the things, there's a lot in this book that you discuss. You touch on a lot of different issues, and I'm sure we could talk for a long time about them. But I picked out kind of a couple of main ones that I thought were interesting just to ask you about. And the first was just, there seems to be, with most of the characters, but I guess mainly Akorfa and Selasi, this constant conflict between the choices that we make ourselves because of what we feel we should make, what we feel we want to do or we desire to do, and then the inherited kind of patterns and what we feel we should do from society. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit more about that conflict, both how you approached it in the book, but also, I guess, more in a Ghanaian context, what you think. Do you think the book suggests that there's some hope that could change, that those inherited patterns could potentially become less of a burden on your characters? Is that something you were looking to explore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is something that I explore in both of my books, His Only Wife and now Nightbloom, and how it is that the demands that society makes of us, that our families, place on us, how these things then constrain us and just make it harder for us to be true to ourselves. And, and I think you find this everywhere, but to different degrees. I think Ghana is a place where the individual is often required to subordinate themselves, their desires, their dreams to the collective, the family, especially.
Yeah.
And that can just be really difficult in that it often requires sacrifices that are quite unfair in some cases. And family is extremely important. I think if it's community is extremely important, especially if you live in a place where you can't necessarily rely on the state to do things for you. But at the same time, it's binding and often not in a good way, or sometimes not in a good way. So in Nightbloom, for example, we see, despite how unhappy Selasi is with her experience in Akorfa's house, her father is still saying, you should be grateful to them. And, other members of the family saying, no, you should still be close to them. And she's saying, no, I do not like the way they treated me as a child, and I don't have to be nice to them. And her father's like, well, they are family. And so it's that kind of thing that I'm really keen to explore in my writing. And I mean, I've been asking myself this question. I mean, I've been talking to other Ghanaians and wondering whether things are changing.
Yeah.
Are we gradually getting to a place where people feel less responsible for others? And that's not necessarily a good thing. You don't want to be an individualist where life is only about you, but also you don't want to live in a way that your life is constantly about making sacrifices for others. And I think as Ghana changes, we're having a larger middle class. I mean, the middle class is growing. People have all of these aspirations, and people want their children to go to the best private schools. And as we see in the book, they want their kids to go to Harvard and all of that. I think that is definitely causing people to be more inward looking, focusing on the nuclear family as opposed to this large extended family. But at the same time, the larger extended family, the community remains extremely important, I think.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. I think I couldn't, probably not a good thing to say, but I couldn't figure out how to even put this into a question. But one of the things, there was a lot of like, felt like a lot of performance and a lot of duty. So a lot of almost people masking that. You kind of were always thinking, is this what they want to do? Is this just what they're acting? And also whether it's calculated because they know that that's not the right thing to do, so they put on this mask to do what's right, or whether it's almost like a subconscious thing that is just ingrained in, no, we don't do that, that's not something I'm going to do. Is that something you've thought about, whether it's a conscious or conscious act?
I think there's a degree of performance. But I think all of us, we're all performing to some degree really in our lives.
Yeah.
And the performance, the level of performance can increase or decrease depending on the company in which you find yourself and how you want to impress people and all of that. But I do think that there is, when you think about people's relationships with the family and with the extended family, with the community, I definitely think there is some performance of, what it means to be, I mean, if you take something being a woman, for example, or a young woman, what it means to be a young woman and what is expected of you. But also, I also think that people also feel these things very strongly. And people feel strongly that this is how one should behave. And I've spoken about writing about disrespectful women and enjoying writing about disrespectful women. And these are basically women who might say, I will no longer perform in a certain way. And so, and I talk about disrespect because at least when I was younger in Ghana, you'd hear about, oh, this woman does not respect, she doesn't respect. And when you dig deeper, it's not the standard definition or the standard usage of respect. It is really saying this woman does what she thinks is right. She speaks up for herself. She takes no nonsense, and so she is disrespectful. And you find that this demand of respect is not being made of men in the same way. I have, I've tried to remember and haven't been able to remember a single instance where a man has been told, you need to respect this woman, right? But women are always being told to be respectful. Wives should be respectful to their husbands. And maybe for some people that part is, I think it's definitely a performance, because I think a lot of people are not happy with this imbalance in how with the women often are the ones being asked to be respectful, and often it's in quite unpleasant conditions, and the man isn't being asked to be respectful. So I think that would require some level of performance, at least until one says, I can't perform anymore. Yeah.
So without giving away too much of the plot, so Nightbloom does deal with sexual assault, which I know is a topic that you work on your academic work, that explores how societies fail to enforce consequences for perpetrators quite a lot of the time. So I'd love to just hear a little bit more about how your fiction is informed by your academic work, and also specifically how you chose to approach this writing when you were writing in fiction, because you do write these sections which are obviously devastating in a very particular way, and I can imagine the type of writing to what you're doing in your nonfiction work is completely different. So how did you approach that?
Yes, thank you. Great question. I mean, I've been writing fiction for much, much longer than I've been a researcher, but I have found that my research creeps into the fiction that I write. I don't necessarily, like when I'm doing research, I'm not thinking, oh, I'm going to write a novel about this.
Yes.
But I think it's because I'm spending a lot of time thinking about the subject matter. It just ends up in most of the writing that I do, including the fiction that I write. So yes, I've studied sexual violence, specifically how post-conflict states in Africa respond to sexual violence. Most of my research has been in Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. I've done over 300 interviews in both countries, just in talking to a range of people, including survivors of sexual violence. I'm trying to understand how the state deals with the problem, because with countries that are emerging from civil war, especially in a difficult position, because you find that institutions have been destroyed, and it's just the infrastructure, the expertise, all of the things needed to address sexual violence tend to be absent or mostly absent. And we know that even in countries that have these things, they still continue to fail at addressing sexual violence. So how about countries that don't have these things? So that's what my research has been on. And in some of the interviews that I've stayed with me are interviews with survivors of sexual violence. And when I was writing this book, and when I've written about it in nonfiction, in my academic writing, one of the things that I've tried to do is elevate the voices of survivors. Because when I spoke to women, I was actually very surprised at how open people were, because I went into it thinking, sexual violence is this very horrific thing, and people are not going to want to speak to you. But then I was just surprised at how willing people were to speak with me. And the details they were willing to provide, I just was not expecting it. And I quickly realized that for some people, it was almost cathartic. It was like, oh, there's someone willing to listen.
Maybe
And
no one had ever asked them before, and they just didn't have the chance to talk about it ever.
Yes, or just very few people. And to talk and to listen without judgment. Because for the women that I spoke with, that was a big deal, the judgment. And they said, women were talking about how, people would say, why did I go into his house? Why did I go into his room? And things like that. And so there was, and we see this in, I think, everywhere, where the constant questioning of people who experience sexual violence. And even with men, it's like, well, why didn't you fight this person off? You're a man. So survivors are worried about these things and about how they will be perceived when they tell their stories. And so I think for these people, for these women that I spoke with, the fact that I listened and I didn't pass judgment and I expressed my care for them, I think that made them more willing to talk to me. And so when I wrote about it, I was like, I want to do them justice. In the same way they obviously wanted their story to be heard, I'm going to make sure that their words are prominent on the page. And in academic writing, sometimes you can become so focused on your analysis and your theory and your methodology that you might not give much space to people's words. And this is something that I really wanted to do in my academic writing, and I did. But when it came to fiction, it was different because, first of all, the experience of sexual assault that I write about and the two characters are all fictional.
Yeah.
And so I found myself having to imagine sexual assault. And that's a hard thing to do. Because when with nonfiction, people are telling you about it, you are not spending months constructing scenarios in your head. Whereas that's what you do when you're writing fiction. But at the same time, even though I spent months or even actually years constructing those few moments on the pages, I didn't want the reader to feel what I had felt and to have to dwell on the act as much as I dwelled on the act.
Yeah.
And so when I wrote about sexual assault in the book, very few paragraphs, even though it is profound, even though it follows the characters throughout their lives, the account is really short. And I thought, I don't want to make it about the perpetrator. I want to make it about the person experiencing the violence. And so I thought how their emotions, how they felt, their fears, those are the things that I want to make prominent when I write about this incident, because it is the survivor that matters. And it is the survivor's fears and their hurts and their pain. Those are the things that are important. And I wanted to bring those to the foreground, but without also making it a book in which you are spending a great deal of time reading about someone suffering.
Yeah.
So yes, I try to strike this balance where I wrote about this incident as this really grievous thing, and I wanted the reader to see this, but at the same time, I didn't want that to be the entire book.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you definitely achieved that. Thank you so much for that answer. I just have a couple of more questions that are a little bit more general, just about writing. So first, I just wondered if you had any, what your process is like. So you've mentioned already that you did change the structure quite early on, so there was quite a lot of chopping and changing throughout. But do you have any writing rituals that you do? Did you have any other big changes that happened as you were going, or things that surprised you as you were writing? Like, how did the actual process come about?
Well, the physical process of writing for me, I tend to do a lot of my writing in my head. I say the best places is when I'm walking outside and it's green. I get a lot of work done.
Yeah.
Because I can just, I don't know, there's something about being in nature that makes it much, much easier to write and to think. So I tend to have like an entire story laid out in my head, and it happens over many years. And so when I started this book, it started with the character of Selasi, and I started thinking about Selasi in like 2012 when I was writing my first book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then the character stays with you and you begin to see them doing things and speaking and acting, and it's almost like the layers of a cake where you just start adding layers and layers and layers, and eventually you have this full story with different actors involved. And then I actually started putting words on the page. So this was 2018, late 2017, 2018, I did most of the writing. And then I just spent the next 3 or so years just constantly revising and changing the structure and parts of the story. And I think what tends to happen with me when I write is that in my mind, I think I know the characters well. And I think I know their wants and their desires and their dislikes and all of that. But once you actually begin writing, you find that you're getting to know them even better. And so there's some of the things that I planned in my head just might not even make sense anymore. Because as I get to know them, I'm like, nah, Akorfa would never do this. Yeah, Akorfa would not. Akorfa is a very fancy lady. She's just never going to go to this like roadside stall or restaurant to eat. She wants to go to the nicest of restaurants. So those are the things that start to happen once I begin writing, because as I write, I know them so much better. And then some of what I planned just doesn't fit. And that's fine. I'm always happy to make changes. And I think the biggest change that happened was just the structure, but also characterization. I wasn't when I started off, I really took Selasi's side. And I was a bit harsh when it came to discussing Akorfa. And so in many ways, I was completely swayed by Selasi. And I think one of the biggest changes is me saying, why it's easier. It's easier as a writer to say this person is bad and we're just going to leave it at that. But it's harder for you to kind of excavate and say it's not as simple as good or bad. Is that life makes us the way that we are. And so I started asking myself, what is it about Akorfa that made her the way that she is? And also Akorfa's mother, who is a major player in the book. And it's easy when you read Selasi's section to be like, oh, this woman. But then once Akorfa speaks, and you begin to see why her mother is the way that she is, and the baggage that her mother carries that she then transfers to her child, then you come to understand. So to me, that is what is exciting. Sorry, I'm now going the different direction.
That's great.
That is what is like so exciting about writing, that you can say, okay, it's not so much about, oh, this person is like this, but how did this person get to this stage? It's almost like the psychology of it. That is what excites me about writing. And so I think that's like one of the biggest changes that happened in the book, where I started off a bit like Selasi and like, Akorfa is the worst. And then it was like,
how do you feel now? Are you still on Selasi's side?
No, Selasi remains of the two, Selasi remains my favorite, but I also deeply care about Akorfa. I see her humanity. I see why she is. I mean, like, it makes sense that she is the way that. And see, that's the thing.
Of course, yeah.
To me, it's about the character should make sense. And she makes sense as a character. You can understand why she is the way that she is.
Definitely.
And yeah, so the more she made sense, the more I empathized,
Yeah.
and the more I cared about her. So I do not dislike her. I care deeply about her, but Selasi, of course,
Has your heart.
yes.
My last question is actually just about book clubs and their importance, because obviously your first novel was picked up as Reese Witherspoon's book club pick, which is amazing. And NB Magazine, which I edit, also had it as our book club pick as well. So this might be a bit of a strange question to ask an author, but if you could imagine all around the country, book groups everywhere, some of them picking Nightbloom as their book, what would be the one thing that you would just love readers to take away from it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in the book, but I think what I really wanted to get at is that in many ways we're all struggling with some version of the truth.
Yeah.
And that I guess to have more grace and for people, and to understand, I think to be slow in passing judgments.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a big part of this book, to just be really slow in passing judgments, because we all experience the world in very similar but also very different ways, and that shapes us so much. And I want readers to be able to say that I don't agree with this person, I wouldn't make the choices that they made, but I understand them and I still want the best for them. I think that's something I hope people get out of the book. But also, and my career and my research, of course, comes into this. My career as a researcher comes into this. But I also, when it comes to the issue of sexual assault, the big message, the big points I was trying to make, I became less focused on messaging as I wrote the book, because I was like, I just care about these two women. What I really want people to see is how much society can hurt or help survivors of sexual assault.
Yeah.
And how things that we might not even realize are harmful. So just asking, are you did it really happen? Are you sure? How much did you drink? Just how those little things can discourage people and can silence people, and just how much care we need to put into how we talk about sexual violence, about gender-based violence more broadly, how we really need to be careful about how we talk about these things, and therefore the messaging that we send to survivors about our willingness to hear them and to believe them.
Yeah. Wow, what a poignant message to end on. Thank you. That was really lovely to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everybody for watching. That was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm glad to hear. Me too. It was fascinating. I could ask you many more questions, but maybe another time for your third book.
Yes.